A small aircraft flies low and slow over the Amazon, back and forth in straight lines, like someone mowing a lawn. Underneath it, there is nothing to see, just canopy, an unbroken green ceiling running to the horizon in every direction. The same view humans have had from above that forest for as long as we have been able to fly over it. Mounted in the belly of the plane is an instrument firing laser pulses down into the trees. Hundreds of thousands of them every second. Almost all of those pulses hit leaves and branches and bounce straight back. But a small fraction slip through the tiny gaps in the canopy, strike the actual ground, and return. Later, in an office, a researcher takes all those millions of returns and tells the software to throw away everything that hit a leaf, to delete the forest. And the ground underneath appears. Not soil, not a natural slope, pyramids, stepped earthen platforms more than 20 meters tall, raised causeways running dead straight for kilometers through the jungle, canals, reservoirs, rings of ditches, terraces, thousands of structures laid out in patterns that no river and no landslide has ever produced, sitting silently under trees that people have walked past for centuries without knowing what they were standing on. The Amazon, it turns out, is full of ruins, and almost nobody saw them because they were hidden under the most effective camouflage on Earth. The technology is called LiDAR, and the idea behind it is simple even though the engineering is not. You send out a laser pulse, you time exactly how long it takes to come back, and because you know the speed of light, you know precisely how far away the thing it bounced off is. Do that hundreds of thousands of times a second from a moving aircraft with very accurate positioning, and you build a cloud of tens of millions of points, each one a precise location in three-dimensional space. The magic step is what comes next. In a forest, most of your points describe the canopy, but some of them, the ones that found a gap, describe the ground. Software can separate the two, keep only the lowest returns, and generate what is called a bare earth model, a map of the actual land surface with every tree stripped away. Archaeologists had been using it for a while in other places, most famously in the Maya lowlands of Central America, where it revealed that sites everyone thought were isolated ceremonial centers were actually connected pieces of enormous urban landscapes. But the Amazon was different, and for a long time, almost nobody expected LiDAR to find much there at all. Because there was a story about the Amazon that had been taught for generations, and it was very confident. The story went like this. The Amazon rainforest is pristine wilderness, untouched. A green cathedral that has stood essentially unchanged for thousands of years, populated only by small, scattered, semi-nomadic groups living lightly on the land, moving on before they made any permanent mark. And there was a scientific argument behind it that sounded solid. Amazonian soils are, for the most part, terrible. Heavy rainfall strips nutrients out of them, and most of the fertility in a rainforest is locked up in the living plants rather than the ground. Poor soil cannot support intensive agriculture. No intensive agriculture means no food surplus. No food surplus means no dense population, no cities, no monuments. The forest was described by one influential scholar as a counterfeit paradise, lush to look at and hostile to civilization underneath. It was a clean, logical argument. It was also contradicted by an eyewitness, and that eyewitness had been called a liar for 400 years. In 1542, a Spanish expedition led by Francisco de Orellana traveled down the length of the Amazon River, essentially by accident, having gone looking for something else, and found themselves unable to turn back. A friar traveling with them, Gaspar de Carvajal, wrote an account of what they saw. He described villages strung along the riverbanks almost continuously, some of them stretching for great distances. He described roads leading inland from the water. He described large populations, organized societies, fleets of canoes, and enough people to mount serious armed resistance. He described a land that was crowded. For centuries, that account was treated as exaggeration or fantasy. Later travelers went up the same river and found forest and small dispersed communities, and nothing resembling what Carvajal claimed. The obvious conclusion was that a friar in a desperate situation had inflated what he saw, or made it up entirely, to make a better story for the Spanish court. Then the lasers went up, and the ground came back into view, and it began to look very much as though Carvajal had been describing exactly what was in front of him. Two discoveries in particular reframed the whole question. In the Llanos de Mojos, in the Bolivian Amazon, a LiDAR survey published in 2022 revealed the remains of a society archaeologists call the Causeways culture. What emerged from the bare earth model was not a village. It was a settlement system, with large sites containing monumental platform mounds and stepped pyramidal structures rising more than 20 meters, surrounded by defensive ditches and enclosures, and connected outward across the landscape by raised causeways running in dead straight lines for kilometers, along with canals and water management works. Big primary centers, smaller secondary centers around them, and the whole thing woven together into a single organized network spread across a very large area. It was described as evidence of a distinctly Amazonian form of low-density urbanism, dating to roughly 1,000 years ago and earlier. Then, in early 2024, a survey of the Upano Valley in the Ecuadorian Amazon, on the eastern slopes of the Andes, produced something even older and in some ways even more startling. LiDAR revealed over 6,000 rectangular earthen platforms, the foundations of houses and other buildings, arranged in groups, along with agricultural fields and drainage systems. And running through all of it, roads. Wide, straight, deliberately engineered roads, some of them around 10 meters across, running for many kilometers, cutting through the terrain rather than following it. That landscape was occupied starting around 2,500 years ago, which makes it one of the oldest known urban networks in the Amazon, and it was home to a large population living in a permanently built environment. Straight roads are the detail that tends to convince people. A river meanders, a game trail wanders, a road that runs straight for 10 kilometers through difficult ground and cuts across obstacles rather than going around them is a decision made by an organized society with the labor and the authority to carry it out. And these are not isolated finds. Across the Amazon basin, hundreds of geometric earthworks known as geoglyphs have been documented. Large ditched enclosures in squares, circles, and combinations of both, many of which only became visible to researchers when modern deforestation stripped the trees off them, which is its own uncomfortable irony. So the obvious question became, how much more is down there? Researchers tried to answer it with the data they had, and the honest answer is that the data covers almost nothing. All the LiDAR flown over the Amazon for archaeological purposes adds up to a tiny sliver of the basin, a fraction of 1%. In 2023, a team took the earthworks found in that sliver, combined them with what is known about where such sites tend to be located, and built a statistical model to estimate how many remain undiscovered across the whole forest. The estimate came back in the range of 10,000 to 24,000 undiscovered pre-Columbian earthworks still sitting under the canopy, which would mean the great majority of the built history of the Amazon has never been seen by anyone alive. But the most surprising consequence of all this is not architectural, and it changes how you look at the forest itself rather than at the ruins under it. So if you want to know what these societies left behind, that is still alive and still growing today, take a moment to subscribe, because the biggest artifact they left is not a pyramid, and you have almost certainly seen pieces of it without recognizing what you were looking at. Start with the soil, because the soil was supposed to be the reason none of this could exist. Scattered across the Amazon, there are patches of ground that are completely unlike the surrounding earth. Instead of the thin, pale, nutrient-poor soil typical of the region, these patches are deep, black, and remarkably fertile. They are known as Amazonian dark earths, or terra preta. They are not natural. They are the accumulated residue of human settlement, built up over long periods from charcoal, ash, food waste, bone, and broken pottery, worked into the ground around places where people lived. Charcoal is the key ingredient because it is extremely stable and it holds nutrients and moisture in a way ordinary tropical soil cannot. The result is a soil that has stayed fertile for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years after the people who made it were gone. Farmers in the Amazon today actively seek out these patches because ground made by ancient settlements still grows better crops than the ground next to it. So the argument that Amazonian soil could not support dense population had the causality backwards in these areas. The people did not find good soil and settle on it. They settled, and over generations they made good soil. And then there are the trees. Researchers examining the composition of Amazonian forest have found something that is difficult to explain by natural processes alone. Tree species that are useful to people and that show signs of having been domesticated or managed appear far more often than chance would predict, and they are notably concentrated in the areas around known archaeological sites. Brazil nut, cacao, various palms, fruit trees, species that feed people, cluster around the places people lived. The straightforward reading is that these societies were not simply clearing forest to farm in the way we picture farming. They were managing forest, encouraging useful species, planting and tending and propagating them across generations, gradually shifting the makeup of the woodland around their settlements toward things they could eat and use. And crucially, the trees are still there. Those species are still hyperabundant in those areas today, centuries after the societies that favored them collapsed, which means that a substantial part of what we look at and call untouched primary rainforest is carrying a legible human fingerprint in its species composition. The forest is not just growing on top of the ruins. In places, the forest is itself the ruin, a living monument that has outlasted the earthworks it grew over. That is the part that genuinely changes how you see the place. You can stand in Amazon rainforest, surrounded by wilderness, in a spot that looks like nothing has ever happened there, and be standing on soil built by human hands, under trees planted by human decisions, on top of a buried causeway. Which leaves the obvious question: if people were living there in those numbers, building all of that, where did they go? The short answer is that they died, and they died fast, and it happened before most Europeans ever got there to see it. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought diseases that had never existed there, including smallpox, measles, and influenza. Populations with no prior exposure had no immunity, and the mortality was catastrophic on a scale that is hard to hold in your head. Epidemics moved along trade routes and river networks far faster than the colonists themselves did, which means that in many regions, the population collapse arrived years or decades ahead of any European. Later travelers went up the Amazon and found a thinly populated forest and reasonably concluded that a thinly populated forest was the normal state of things. They were looking at the aftermath and mistaking it for the baseline. Complex societies do not survive that. Settlements were abandoned. Maintained landscapes stopped being maintained. Causeways, plazas, mounds, and fields were left to the fastest-growing forest on the planet, and within a few centuries the canopy had closed over the top of all of it. The Amazon we inherited as the image of untouched wilderness is in significant part forest that grew over an emptied civilization. Now, the honest part, because this story is often told with far more confidence than the evidence supports. LiDAR does not find civilizations, it finds shapes. It produces a map of the ground surface, and archaeologists interpret those shapes, confirming what a structure is, when it was built, who built it, and what it was for, still requires people digging in the dirt for years. A great many of these newly mapped features have never been excavated and may not be for decades, if ever. The estimate of 10 to 24,000 undiscovered earthworks is a statistical projection built from a very small sample, not a count. It is a reasonable and useful estimate, and it could turn out to be substantially too high or too low. The word city is also doing a lot of work, and archaeologists argue about it. These were low-density settlements, spread out, mixed with gardens and managed forest, which is very different from a dense walled city of the kind the word usually calls to mind. Some researchers think the term fits a distinctly tropical form of urbanism. Others think it imports the wrong picture. That debate is live and unresolved. Population estimates for the pre-contact Amazon vary enormously between researchers, and anyone quoting one specific number as settled fact is overselling it. And there is one more caution that matters. The finding that people shaped the Amazon for thousands of years is sometimes twisted into an argument that the forest is not really natural, so it does not really need protecting. That is a misuse of the evidence. What the archaeology describes is management carried out over many generations by people who depended on the forest continuing to exist and who worked with its regrowth rather than against it. That has nothing in common with clearing it with heavy machinery for pasture. If anything, the evidence points the other way, showing that the forest and human societies coexisted at large scale for a very long time, and that the knowledge of how to do that belonged to the people who lived there. Which brings up the last thing, and it is the one that gets skipped most often. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon are still there, and many of them are the descendants of the societies these surveys are uncovering. In a lot of cases, their own histories and oral traditions described large ancestral settlements long before an aircraft ever flew a LiDAR grid over the canopy. Those accounts were treated the same way Carvajal was treated, as stories. What the lasers actually did was not discover the existence of these places. It provided the kind of evidence that outsiders were finally willing to accept. That aircraft is still flying, back and forth, over an area that adds up to a rounding error of the total forest. Every survey seems to find more. Somewhere under the canopy there are pyramids nobody has stood on, roads nobody has walked, and plazas that have been dark for 500 years. They were never lost. They were just underneath something, and we did not have a way to look through it until now. If you enjoy true stories about the things hidden in plain sight in the natural world, stories most people never hear, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another place the world had already given up on. Take care of yourself, and stay curious.